and Naomi Turner stepped into the small bakery cafe just as the cold morning air followed her inside. Her shift at the hospital had ended only an hour earlier, and the tiredness in her body felt deeper than usual. Her feet ached, her shoulders were stiff, and her eyes carried the weight of a night spent working while the city slept. Still, she stood upright, holding herself together, because she had one simple goal, and she wanted to buy a sandwich and a coffee for her young son before school, something warm that would make his morning easier, and she checked her purse before reaching the counter. There was very little money inside, just enough for the basics. Her phone vibrated weakly in her hand, and the battery almost gone, a quiet reminder that she had no room for mistakes that morning. Even so, Naomi did not rush or panic. She waited her turn, calm and patient, and believing that honesty and politeness were enough in a place like this. As she stood there, she felt eyes on her. Conversations behind her slowed, and a few people glanced at her openly. Others watched from the corners of their eyes. Naomi noticed, but she had learned long ago not to react to stares, and she focused on the menu, quietly calculating prices, making sure she stayed within what she could afford. When she reached the counter, she spoke softly and clearly, and asking for a simple order. The cashier looked at her, not with the routine friendliness given to other customers, but with doubt, and the pause that followed felt longer than it should have been. Then the cashier asked a question that cut deeper than Naomi expected, and asking whether she even had money to pay. The words hung in the air. Naomi felt heat rise to her face, not from anger, but from shock, and she had done nothing to deserve that question. Around her, customers shifted. Instead of defending her or staying silent, some of them nodded along, and as if the suspicion made sense. No one asked why the question was being asked. No one challenged it. Naomi calmly opened her purse and tried to explain, and her voice steadied despite the knot forming in her chest. She spoke respectfully, hoping reason would clear the misunderstanding. But reason never arrived, and the manager stepped in, not to listen, but to decide. Without asking Naomi a single question, without checking facts, the manager chose the easier path, and bias felt safer than truth. The situation escalated quickly. Security was called, and the attention of the entire cafe shifted fully onto Naomi, and people watched as if a crime had been committed. Naomi tried one last time to explain, her voice still controlled, still respectful. It did not matter, and decisions had already been made about who she was. Security escorted her out the door. The sound of it closing behind her felt final, heavy. Outside, and the cold air hit her face, sharper than before. She stood there for a moment frozen, holding her purse, and trying to understand how a simple morning task had turned into public humiliation. Tears came slowly. Not because she was hungry, not because she was tired, and they came because something more painful had been taken from her. Her dignity had been questioned in front of strangers. Her honesty had been doubted without reason, and the way people had looked at her made her feel smaller than she was. She wiped her face, standing alone on the sidewalk, and thinking of her son and how she would explain coming home empty-handed. The cafe behind her returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. But for Naomi, and the moment stayed heavy, a reminder of how easily respect can be stripped away, and even from someone who walks through the world with quiet dignity and no harmful intentions at all. Naomi woke up every day before the sun did, and the alarm was never loud enough to match her exhaustion, but she got up anyway because someone smaller than her depended on it. Her son slept in the next room, and unaware of how carefully his mother measured every hour, every dollar, and every ounce of strength she had left. Since the day she lost her husband, and life had not slowed down to let her grieve. It had moved faster, demanding more from her than she ever thought she could give. She worked wherever work was available, and long shifts that burned her feet, jobs that left her hands aching and her back stiff. Sometimes she came home so tired that even sitting down felt like a task, but she still packed lunches, checked homework, and listened to her son talk about his day. Rest was a luxury she could not afford, and complaining felt useless when bills needed paying and a child needed stability. So she learned to carry silence like armor. Naomi believed deeply in kindness, and even when kindness was never returned. She taught her son to say thank you, to hold doors open, to see people as people before anything else, and she did this not because the world had been kind to her, but because it had not. She knew how cruelty felt, how quickly it could strip someone of confidence and warmth, and she refused to let that cruelty shape the heart of her child. Judgment was not new to her. She had seen it in sideways looks, in tightened voices, and in moments where respect disappeared before she even spoke. Most days she absorbed it and moved on, telling herself that survival mattered more than pride. But sometimes, and like on that morning, the weight landed heavier, and it reminded her how fragile dignity could be in a world that decided worth based on appearance rather than effort or character. She felt the sting, but she did not lash out. Anger would have given others control over her emotions, and she refused to hand that power away. Instead, she stood still, breathed deeply, and held on to what she knew to be true about herself. She was a mother, she was a mother. She was doing her best in circumstances she did not choose, and that was how Naomi survived. Not by shouting, not by breaking, but by choosing strength when anger tempted her, and dignity when the world expected her to fall apart. And the man sat alone in the corner of the café, where the morning light barely reached his table, and where no one paid him any attention. And he wore a plain coat and held a cup of coffee that had long gone untouched. To everyone else he looked ordinary, like another tired customer passing time before work, and no one knew his name and no one wondered why he was there. That invisibility allowed him to see everything clearly. From his seat he noticed Naomi the moment she walked in, and he saw the way she hesitated near the door as if bracing herself against the cold and the world at the same time. And he recognized exhaustion in her posture, the kind that comes from responsibility, not laziness. And as she waited in line, he watched how people looked at her with curiosity that quickly turned into judgment. And he did not interrupt or react because he understood something many people forget, that moments like these reveal more truth when allowed to unfold. And when the cashier questioned Naomi's ability to pay, the man felt a familiar heaviness in his chest. And he had heard that tone before, the one dressed as caution, but rooted in assumption. And he watched Naomi respond calmly with dignity intact, even as her space in the room began to shrink. Customers murmured and nodded as if suspicion were contagious, and each reaction layered itself on the moment, and the man quietly noted every face, every word, every silence. The manager's decision came swiftly and without care, and from the corner the man saw how easily authority leaned toward bias rather than fairness. And he saw security approach Naomi as if she were a problem to be removed instead of a person to be heard. The cafe grew tense, yet no one spoke up, and the man did not stand or raise his voice. He stayed where he was, not because he agreed, but because he understood that accountability sometimes requires patience. And as Naomi was escorted out the door, the man felt anger but also clarity, and he had learned over many years that immediate reaction often gets dismissed, but careful observation creates undeniable truth. And he watched the door close behind her, and saw the way the room exhaled, relieved, as if order had been restored. And he noticed how quickly people returned to their conversations pretending nothing had happened. Only then did the man move, and he finished his coffee, slowly stood up and walked to the counter. And the staff barely glanced at him, unaware that their behavior moments earlier had been quietly recorded, not on a device, but in the memory of someone who understood systems, power, and consequences. And he asked no questions and made no accusations. He paid and left calmly, carrying with him everything he had seen. And outside he paused and looked down the street, where Naomi had stood moments earlier, wiping tears from her face. And she was gone now, swallowed by the city and unaware that someone had witnessed her humiliation with intent to remember it fully. The man did not chase her or call out, and he believed justice did not always need a dramatic entrance. Sometimes it followed quietly behind, waiting for the right moment. And later that day, phone calls would be made, emails would be sent, and conversations would begin that the cafe staff could not yet imagine. And policies would be questioned and stories would surface, not rumors, but facts rooted in observation. And the man's silence would soon transform into accountability, not fueled by anger but by responsibility. And because some truths do not shout in the moment, they wait patiently, gathering strength. And that quiet witness seated in the corner had become the unseen bridge between injustice and the reckoning that would follow. And later that night, the hospital parking area was unusually quiet. The long fluorescent lights hummed above rows of nearly empty cars, and in the air carried the sharp chill of exhaustion that settles after a difficult day. Naomi stepped outside through the side exit, her shift finally over. and her body felt heavy, every muscle aching, her mind still replaying the humiliation from the morning cafe incident. She wanted nothing more than to go home, hug her son, and sleep. As she walked toward the bus stop at the edge of the parking area, she noticed movement near a parked car. At first, and she thought it was someone searching for keys, but then she heard a sound that made her stop. It was not a word, not a shout, but a strained gasp, and the kind that comes from deep inside the chest when air refuses to cooperate. A man stood near his vehicle and gripping the door with one hand while the other pressed tightly against his chest. His face was pale, his knees trembling. Naomi slowed, and her instincts pulling her forward even as fear whispered warnings in her head. A few other hospital staff passed by, noticed him and hesitated. One woman glanced, and then looked away and quickened her pace. Another man paused, shook his head nervously, and stepped back as if afraid of getting involved. The man collapsed to the ground, and Naomi froze for half a second. She was exhausted. She was emotionally drained. She had almost nothing left to give. But she could not move past him, and her feet carried her forward before her mind finished arguing. She knelt beside him, placing her bag on the cold pavement. "Sir," she said gently, and trying to keep her voice steady. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered, unfocused, and his breathing came in shallow bursts. Naomi recognized the signs immediately, and she worked in a hospital. She had seen this too many times. She reached for her phone to call for help. The screen flickered, then went dark. Dead battery, and her heart pounded. She looked around and raised her voice, asking someone to call emergency services. No one responded right away. A few people watched from a distance, and unsure, uncomfortable, unwilling to step closer. Naomi did not wait. She ran back inside the hospital building, ignoring the ache in her legs, and she went to a small vending area near the entrance, digging through her purse as she ran. Her fingers found the last bills she had, and it was supposed to be bus fare and breakfast money. She bought bottled water and the counter medication she knew could help in the moment. When she returned, and the man was still on the ground, his condition worsening. Naomi knelt again, supporting his head, helping him take small sips of water, guiding him as calmly as she could, and she spoke to him softly, even though he could barely respond, telling him it was coming, telling him to stay awake. Minutes stretched painfully long. Her hands trembled, but she stayed. She blocked out the stares and whispers, focusing only on the man's breathing, on keeping him alive. Finally, sirens broke through the silence, and emergency responders rushed in, taking over with practiced efficiency. One of them looked at Naomi and nodded with quiet respect. "You did the right thing," he said, "and you probably saved him." As they loaded the man onto a stretcher, his eyes opened briefly. He looked at Naomi, confusion mixed with gratitude, and she squeezed his hand lightly and smiled, though her own eyes burned with tears. She did not ask his name. She did not wait for thanks, and she stepped back as the ambulance doors closed, suddenly feeling the full weight of the day crash over her. Naomi stood alone in the parking lot, pockets empty, and body exhausted, heart bruised but intact. She did not know who the man was or why fate had placed him in her path. All she knew was that when faced with a choice, and she had chosen humanity again. She walked toward the bus stop under the flickering lights, unaware that this quiet act of compassion, and done without witnesses or expectations, was about to change everything in ways she could not yet imagine, and the bakery cafe opened like any other morning, warm lights, fresh routine, until the door opened again and authority walked in, without warning, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. Several officials entered, followed by a calm, composed man, whose presence shifted the air in the room. Conversations soared, hands froze mid-movement, and instinctively everyone knew this was not an ordinary visit. And the man stepped forward and removed his coat, revealing a hospital. Instantly, Dr. Michael Turner, chief medical officer of the city. His name alone carried weight. His reputation was built on integrity, discipline, and service. He looked around the room, slowly taking in the familiar space where just one day earlier dignity had been stripped from someone who deserved none of that treatment. And the staff stood uneasy. The cashier stiffened. The manager forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. Fear replaced the confidence they had worn before. A Dr. Turner said clearly, his voice he said had contrast an incident. that occurred in the previous morning involving a woman who had been publicly humiliated, removed without cause. And murmurs spread through the room. Customers remembered some look comfortably. Dr. Turner continued explaining that he had personally witnessed the entire event while sitting quietly in the corner, unseen and unacknowledged. He described the stares, the assumptions, the questioning of worth based on known parents, and how authority had chosen bivers over fairness. And then his voice changed, not louder but deeper. He said the woman who had been treated as a suspect was Naomi Turner, his sister, and the room fell into silence. He explained that Naomi was a hospital worker, a single woman and woman of integrity. But more than that, she was the same woman who later, that night, had life in the hospital lot parking area when he collapsed and others walked away. And shock moved through the cafe like a wave. Faces drained of color. The manager, as if struck, Dr. Turner explained how Naomi had used her last money to buy medicine and water, how she stayed with him until emergency help arrived, how she never asked his name or expected gratitude because she acted from humanity, not recognition. And the power in the room shifted instantly. Arrogance dissolved, fear, shame crept into every corner. Where judgment once stood, the authority that had removed Naomi now stood exposed and small. Dr. Turner stated clearly that no one had the right to decide a person's worth based on assumption, and that what happened in this cafe violated not just ethics, but basic human decency. And he asked that Naomi be brought back, not as a suspect, not as a problem, but as a human being whose dignity mattered. When Naomi entered the cafe, escorted respectfully, every eye turned toward her. The same space that once rejected her now stood silent. She walked in with her head high, not defiant, not proud, just steady. And Dr. Turner stood beside her and said, "This is the woman you judged. This is the woman who saved my life. And this is the woman who deserved respect from the beginning." And no one spoke. The truth stood fully exposed in the very place it had been denied. Nothing could undo that moment, because the lesson had already settled deep into the room. Where injustice once lived and accountability now stood firmly in its place. And Naomi stood in the same cafe where her dignity had once been questioned, but heart carried no desire for revenge. She did not raise her voice or demand punishment. She simply asked for fairness and for change. She spoke calmly about what had happened and how it felt to be judged without being known. Her words were not fueled more anger, but by truth. And that truth carried more weight than any accusation. And the owners of the cafe listened closely this time, because the power was no longer one-sided, and denial could not hide behind excuses. Investigations followed and consequences were set. Policies were reviewed and staff members were required to undergo serious training, not an honors performance. As a responsibility, the CAF could not erase what happened, but accused to learn from it. And yet the most powerful outcome did not come from official actions. It came from awareness. Naomi's story spread through the city, not as gossip, but as reflection. People talked about how easily judgment forms and how quickly dignity can be taken away. Strangers who read about her experience saw this in the situation. Some as the one being judged, others as horrors, as the silent observers who said nothing. And Naomi did not enjoy the attention. She never wanted to be a symbol. She was simply a mother, a worker, and a woman who believed that kindness mattered. But as her story reached more hearts, it became something larger than her. It became a mirror showing society its own habits and flaws. And people began to question their own behavior. How many times had they crossed the street, avoided eye contact, or assumed the worst, without knowing a story behind a face? Naomi experience reminded them that respect should not depend on skin color, money, or status, because humanity is not earned, it is inherent. And at community gatherings, schools, and workplaces, her story was shared as a lesson not about blame, but about responsibility. Teachers spoke to students about empathy. Managers discussed unconscious bias in families, talked at dinner tables about how quickly people are labeled and dismissed. And Naomi continued her life quietly, raising her son, going to work, and choosing kindness. Even when it was difficult, she taught her child that strength does not come from proving others wrong, but from standing firm in what is right. She explained that people may fail to see your worth, but that does not mean it is not there. And the man she saved recovered fully and never forgot her, not because she was his sister, But because she was the one who stayed when others turned away, he often said that the night she helped him changed how he saw people and the world. He believed that life gives lessons through unexpected hands. And the cafe eventually reopened with new practices, and a different energy. Cust noticed the changed staff, greeted everyone with equal respect, and the walls carried a quiet reminder of what happens when assumptions are challenged. And Naomi never returned there for attention, but once she did walk in with her son, they were welcomed warmly and treated with care, not because of who she was connected to, but because someone finally understood what should have been clear from the beginning. And her story remained a reminder that the person society looks down on today may be the one who saves a life tomorrow, and that humanity must always come before assumptions, because once dignity is given freely, the world becomes a place where fairness is possible and change can begin.